Well, good morning and welcome back, everybody. Hope you guys are doing really good. Just a few minutes to go here, and then we will get things going. But I appreciate your attendance, and yeah, about 2 minutes. Good morning, Kelly. Hey, Megan and Eva. Hello, everyone. Good to see you guys. No coffee there. Iced coffee, my preference. Hello, everyone. I'll be right back. Hey, Drew. Hello, everybody. Okay, guys, so it's pretty much 9 a.m., so I'm going to let us get started. Welcome back. Hope you had a good weekend, and today what we're doing is we're basically going to wrap up this discussion of the economic inequality debate. Is there any moral obligation that we have to assist the global poor or not? And so we are pretty much finished with the work of Peter Singer. There's just a couple of last objections and replies that I kind of need to go over to finish that. And then once we finish him today, we'll just move right into the Garrett Hardin article, which is kind of like the alternative to what Peter Singer has argued. So let me just refresh our memory. It's been a long weekend, I guess, for some, so let me just kind of bring it back up to speed. Basically, Peter Singer's overall position is that we have a moral obligation to assist the global poor living in extreme poverty. And he starts the paper off by just defining the concept of absolute poverty, which is not having enough income or wealth to meet basic human needs for food, clothing, and shelter. And so given this definition, there's actually a lot of people in the world that live in absolute poverty, upwards of 1 billion. And being a utilitarian, Peter Singer just wonders, isn't there something we could do to make the situation better? Because as everyone understands, utilitarianism is the viewpoint that your moral obligation is to do whatever creates the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So, this type of pain and suffering in the third world, starvation and what have you, is one of the bigger negative weights against overall human happiness. He says that we can't claim that this is a problem that's due to scarcity, but it's instead due to waste and inefficient use of the available resources. So when you consider, on the other hand, absolute affluence, which is having more than enough income and wealth to meet the basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter, that's the way that people like us live in the first world. And he asks the question, do we have a moral obligation to, let's say, give some of our additional wealth that we have beyond necessity to help alleviate the condition of absolute poverty and hunger? He wonders, is there a difference between the failure to assist and killing? Now, once he poses that question, he then reports what he calls differences between killing and failing to assist. And we talked about those, like, for example, that it's there's different motivation. The identifiability of the victim is different. There's a different level of certainty of the outcome. It's not hard to avoid killing people, but it's very hard to save all the lives that you could save, and so forth. So he mentions these differences, but after listing them, he goes back to show that although they may indicate that killing is worse than the failure to assist, that there's still some significant wrongness with the failure to assist anyway. So having gone over that, he presents the obligation to assist argument, which provides these premises which claim that if you can prevent a bad thing without making a comparable sacrifice, then you ought to. And absolute poverty is bad, and we can prevent some without making any comparable sacrifice. So therefore, we should do that. Then at the tail end of the meeting last time, we started to discuss objections to this argument. So what were some of the objections? Now we're running to the end, so I just want to put those objections on the board again and then go over his responses that he gives to them. Okay, so now just finishing up Peter Singer, just so I have a clear header here. I'm still just looking at his work for a moment longer. And these were objections to his argument. To the obligation to assist argument. Okay, so if you can remember, some of these objections included taking care of our own, property rights, leave it to the government, and then there's one more that I didn't get to go over, which is triage, that I'd like to mention really quick. Okay, so let's take stock of these objections one more time. Now, you heard the argument that if you can prevent a bad thing without making comparable sacrifice, that you should, and that absolute poverty is bad, and that we can prevent some at least without making comparable sacrifices. So here are the objections given against that. First of all, a person can say, no, I don't have an obligation to assist the global poor. If I do have an obligation to help or care for any people, it's just not the international third world poor, but just my own. And my own could be my family, my friends, maybe my fellow citizens, but not the international poor scattered throughout the whole world. Property rights objection. That would be the argument that although I could give to the poor, I'm not obligated to do it, because when I have income and wealth, that's part of my property. And property rights entitle me to do whatever I like with the wealth and income that I've earned. I may spend it, I may save it, I may even spend it on unwise or foolish things and stuff that helps nobody, even including me. But that's my right under my property rights, and therefore the argument could be given that I can't be obligated to give away wealth, since that violates property rights. Leaving it to the government. Some people will argue that although perhaps it's good for there to be charitable giving to the poor and to the third world, that should be done based on a government program rather than an individual charitable donation. Private citizens giving aid is unreliable, subject to whims, and sometimes people argue even that wealthy philanthropists will use charitable aid as a cover for PR, positive PR, to cover up for other things they're doing that are less, benign within their business. So leaving it to the government's another objection. Let it not be argued then that it's individual people who have an obligation to assist, but rather the government, which can collect from all our tax revenues as a whole. And then finally, there's this triage objection, which I didn't get to report on. So, okay, triage. Triage is a policy that is implemented when you have a mass casualty emergency, or like a surplus of injured or sick persons and a deficit of available medical personnel. It's a crisis not unlike what the United States and other countries can face in the midst of a pandemic, when you have an overwhelmed healthcare system. So basically imagine that, right? It's not even difficult to imagine because it's somewhat real right now. Imagine that there's way too many people injured for available medical personnel to provide one-on-one specialized care, at least initially. So triage is a policy that is sometimes, it's an emergency policy that is sometimes utilized in such scenarios, like say you have a terrorist attack or a natural disaster or a pandemic or on the battlefield of war, when there's all of a sudden a huge influx of injured persons, which overwhelms the capacity of medical professionals to provide help. So more people injured than there are doctors, basically. What do you do in a situation like that? Well, you actually have to make tough decisions about how to prioritize care to make the most efficient use of the scarce medical resources that are available right there. Okay, so with triage, the word tri is built into it, and that's intentional because it divides people into three groups, like triangle is 3 or tricycle, right, 3. So in triage, let me just show you a little graph here. At the top, I'll put the graph. Or a diagram, rather, we can call it. So take people that are on the scene of or in the environment where there's this medical problem and divide them into 3 groups. Okay, so over here we have the worst case people. These are people so injured or sick that they will probably die even if they get help, unfortunately. Even with help. So I don't know if it's a little small, but what I've written here is just that, you know, associated with this tangent line, it says the people that are so injured that they will probably die even if they do get help. Okay, so that's a sad thing to mention, but of course sometimes people in a situation like this are so far gone that they're beyond the reach of medical assistance. So it's basically like a lost cause, still alive for the moment, but not likely to survive no matter what is done, even if you provide extraordinary help. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, all 3 parties in this little division here are injured or sick, but these are the most injured or sick. And these on the other end of the extreme are the least either sick or injured. So this would be the category of people whose injuries are so minor that they will probably, what do you think, survive even if they don't get help. Okay, so injuries so minor or sickness so minor that they'll probably survive, basically, even without help, or at least without immediate help. Probably survive even without help. Okay, so this extreme, people that are so gravely injured that they're probably going to die even if they get lots of help. And over here, people who have injuries, but they're light injuries comparatively. So this is like the walking wounded, or the people who can attend to their injuries later. So they're not the most urgent case out of all those that are affected by whatever the problem is. Now here's this middle category, the all-important intermediate middle category. What do you think would be the nature or extent of that category's either injuries or sickness? So splitting the difference between these two. So injured, they're probably going to die no matter what. Minor injuries, such that they'll probably survive even if they don't get the help. So what about the middle group? What do you think is this situation there? Anybody can take a guess? Middle category within triage. It's a real medical policy that is employed in mass casualty emergencies, overwhelmed hospitals, overtaxed healthcare systems. So what do you think is going on with that middle category? All 3 sides of this division are injured, but those are injuries that must be treated for survival. Okay, that's one way to put it. Yeah, Jason. So those would be the category of people whose injuries are such that they will probably, what do you think, die if they don't get help, or survive if they do get help. So that's the critical group that's right on the bubble where the intervention of medical assistance is going to make the biggest difference to whether they live or die. Because on this side, the assistance is probably not going to change anything. And also here, the assistance is probably not going to make a difference because people were going to survive anyway. So yeah, you're right. Both Jason, Megan, and Drew, these are all correct ways of putting it. So these are people whose injuries are such that they'll survive with help or die without help. It's going to be a little tight to write that here, so I'm going to try to write it. Injuries such that, I'll try to make it very brief, die without help or survive with help. Okay? So here we have our little triage division of 3. Now, some people in life are actually triage technicians, and they have to make very, very tough-minded but utilitarian, in the end, decisions about how to ration off care when you do have a surplus of injured or dying persons and a deficit, a shortage of available medical personnel. So, okay, let me ask you guys then, think about it just rationally. Suppose that we have a triage situation where care has to be rationed off. Shall we make it so that the doctors and medics focus the first wave of medical attention on this category? Tell me yes or no, and why or why not. Should we attend to the most gravely injured persons on the scene first and devote all our precious medical resources to them initially? Would that be the right call according to triage? Why or why not? Let me know. So is that the right wise policy to get the maximum amount of life-saving potential? No. Okay, Drew, it is not. That's correct. But why? Why is it that it would be unwise, right, to exclusively attend to this group at the beginning? Okay, Megan, because if you are, they're more likely to die and you're wasting the medical product you could argue. Right. Wastage of resources that may otherwise save others. Yeah, exactly, guys. Good. So it's sad to say nobody wants any of the persons on the whole side of this spectrum to be harmed or injured or die. But the thing is, when you're focusing your attention on this group, you're basically throwing a lot of precious medical resources and with shortage of time to work with at a group that's basically too far gone. Too far gone. They're going to succumb to their injuries despite your best efforts for the most part. So while you're focusing on them, the same amount of attention could have been diverted over here, and it would have resulted in a greater amount of people having been converted from would have died to now are going to survive. So you're basically throwing a lot of resources at a lost cause while there's a group over here whose injuries are just a little less severe, but where the same attention could have actually saved lives. Okay. Another question. This one's even easier, I guess. What about this side? Shall we focus all our attention on this group first? Paramedics, first responders, medics, and doctors arrive on the scene, and we got these 3 categories of people flagged and divided as such by a triage technician. Should we go to their side first? And Eva, again, that's true. No, because we don't have enough doctors for everybody. So, we have to ration off the care to make the most efficient use of it and maximize the life-saving power of the attention that could be given. So here, we would not attend to them either, because although they're sick, while you're focused on them, there's people over here literally dying, where the same medical attention given to them could have prevented death instead of just enhanced their condition, which is non-fatal. So, point being, and now it's, I hope, clear, that with triage anyway, it's always the policy to focus attention on this intermediate group that's on the bubble, the group where the provision of aid is most likely to affect the saving of a life, rather than a person that's already likely to survive or people who's destined to die, as sad as that is. So, look, how can this then function as an objection to the whole argument in favor of assisting the global poor? Well, some people make this pretty, I guess, clever argument or sophisticated argument that, in a way, by urging us to focus on the poorest of the poor with our relief efforts, because that's the focus of this article, right? It's not saying help the people that are somewhat poor or, in the developed world living in a homeless shelter, but to try and provide aid, money, food, or whatever to the poorest people in the world that are literally on the brink of starvation, living in absolute poverty, right? But some critics can argue that that violates the logic of triage, because it's like saying, let us focus our efforts to help the people in the worst case condition, where, as sad as it is, it's not likely to address the root causes of poverty. It's not likely to transform the underlying socioeconomic conditions. And so if anything, you place a Band-Aid on the problem, but you don't really fix it. And then the argument goes, you actually artificially allow the cohort of poor persons in the world to grow larger. And then that feeds the problem for a future generation where in that future, there will be an even larger group of poor people needing assistance, but even fewer means for people to provide it. And with dwindling global resources, someone could argue that that sets us up for a bigger collapse in the future, where there's just more people, fewer food, less resources, and then inevitably a larger dying off of people than would have happened if the aid had not been provided initially, allowing the problem to expand. So, you know, is it a good idea to help the poorest of the poor? It might feel good in a way, according to the triage objection, but it doesn't really help the problem. If anything, it adds to the fuel of the problem by not addressing root causes of poverty and merely delaying the issue to the future where the group is larger. I mean, it'd be a tough job to be a triage technician. Can you imagine that? Like, you arrive on the scene of, like, I don't know, a mass casualty incident like the Boston Marathon bombing, and everyone's crying out for help that's out there injured. But you have to flag the different categories of injuries so that people arriving as medics know which ones are the more urgent cases to attend to first, which are the ones that they should just ignore because they're too much to deal with, and which are the ones that are like walking wounded that can sort of handle their injuries later, or at least not so urgently in the immediate term. Now, to Mr. Singer, he has replies to all the objections. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes telling you what his overall, defense is against some of these, significant objections. Yeah, good question. Thank you, Drew, for that follow-up. So by comparing this example to the case of global poverty, it would be like, don't help the poorest of the poor because it's basically the lost cause group. And then first world developed nations like us, we don't really need help anyway, so that would kind of be unnecessary. If any aid then or assistance, economic or otherwise, would be useful, it would be to countries and groups that were making a transition to a developed living standard. But that's a different group than those that are in absolute total poverty. And therefore, it would still tend to contradict the force of Singer's argument, which is that we should try and primarily focus on the poorest of the poor and prevent them from starving. Good, yeah, so that's exactly right there, Drew. Yeah, so in responding to these points, here's what Singer has to say. And I'm just going to talk to you about those responses, starting here with taking care of our own. Okay, so first thing he says about that is, how can you limit the circle of your moral concerns to just, quote unquote, your own? There are people who have needs, basically, and that are all throughout the world. And some of them are closer to you and some of them are farther to you, either in distance or in terms of the nature of your guys' connection or your relationship. But human beings, he would argue, just have needs, and it doesn't really matter the proximity that they have geographically to you. So if you walked past like a little kid on the street that looked like a skeleton with like flies and stuff buzzing around them, and it was just in an American city, it'd probably be pretty hard for you to just ignore them and be like, wow, that kid looks like they're starving, and just continue to go on. You'd probably think, well, I should at least call the local hospital to get someone to come out and pick the kid up and put him into a ICU or something. So when they're in your face, you respond. But the same child that's starving like that, that's not in your immediate area, is somewhere out there in the world. And so he would mention to us that how concerned we are should not depend on the arbitrary nature of how close or far someone is from you geographically. Second thing he would say is that comparing the needs of your own with the needs of the third world global poor is like total apples and oranges. I mean, if you're living in America in the first world like we are, then your families and friends and so forth and fellow citizens are relatively doing well. So how, he argues, could you prioritize the less pressing needs of our own over the life and death struggles of people in the third world? That would seem to be, favoring the less pressing interests over the more pressing interests. And then the third thing he says is, when people talk about our own, it verges dangerously close, he thinks, to like a almost racial way of thinking, because sometimes people say, I'm just going to care about my own. And what they mean by that is not a geographic or national border, but rather a racial kinship. So that's normally thought of as something that is prejudicial or even bigoted, to think I only care about my own. So I know that it wasn't stated in terms of like a racial affinity. But he says, how is there any more moral basis to preferring the interests of your fellow countrymen to members of your own race? It seems like they're both equally either legitimate or illegitimate. So he wonders what principle we're using to group people within our own anyway. Okay, and then secondly, property rights. About property rights, he concedes the point that sure, you have your property rights, and that means that you have the right to not give aid. That's not being debated. But he says the question is more about not whether you have a right to withhold aid, but rather the question is that moral or not? And you're morally entitled to do things. Sorry, you are legally entitled to do things that are morally questionable. Like you have a right to drop out of school today. That's your right. You can't be forced to continue. But is it a good thing? Is it a good choice? Is it a wise choice? Is it the right thing for you? So there's more to be said about whether a thing is a good thing to do or not than to just say you have the right to do it. Furthermore, he says, if you're like a Christian, and he knows that most people reading his article are reading it in the West, so the odds are that most of them will be Christian. If you're a Christian, he says, then you should follow the moral principles expressed in the Bible by Jesus, and especially in the New Testament. It says over and over again that you should really care a lot about the poor and the weak, that you should be your brother's keeper, that the meek shall inherit the earth, that it is harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, and on and on and on. So the Bible is saturated with all these fine phrases, which include singing the praises of care for the poor. It never says anything like the poor are not industrious enough, they've not worked hard enough, therefore let us ignore them and focus on your own family and friends, and that's all that matters. It's not what it says in the Bible. So he says it also runs somewhat contrary to a person's religious convictions if they uphold this as the right reason to withhold on aid. Okay, so those are a couple of points. First of all, that just having the right to do something doesn't settle all the questions about whether it's a good thing morally. And then the second point is that it seems to stand somewhat contrary to religious teachings of the Bible that many people claim to adhere to. Now, leaving it to the government, I've always thought that that was one of the better objections, because I often think about how would I defend my own conduct in face of such arguments. Because, actually, to just be full disclosure, I give some money to environment, like I give a small donation monthly to Greenpeace or the Environmental Fund, but I don't have anything that I do in terms of like aid to the poor globally or whatever. I'm not saying that I wouldn't want to do that at some point, but I just haven't done it yet. And when I think about what I might say in reply to like a Peter Singer, sometimes I've thought that this is an effective objection, because all it is saying is not that aid is a bad idea, but shouldn't we consider it the government's obligation whereby would all be invested into it mutually? But he says this is Singer now replying to that. Singer says, well, okay, maybe the government should do more, but that's not mutually exclusive to urging people privately to also do more as citizens. And so he thinks that there's really no reason to deny that individuals should do more, because more is better. So if individuals gave and government, then that's more aid. And by the way, he says that the aid is likelier to come from the government if people give, because why would the government impose a burden on us for charitable aid that it's not shown that we want to take on by ourselves? So it would be more productive towards the stated goal of getting more aid to be given, to have it given individually also. Now, triage, that's probably one of the most sophisticated objections to what he's saying. His reply is also interesting. He says, well, part of the triage objection is that if you help the poorest of the poor, you're basically helping a lost cause, and you're maybe even making the problem bigger by expanding that cohort for the future and just making the problem grow. Well, he says if the problem and the worry is that there's going to be an overgrowth of population in the poor world because it's been stimulated through international aid, he argues there are more humane alternatives to hoping that those numbers decline than to withdraw aid and hope they decline by means of higher death rates. A better alternative would be to decrease birth rates in those parts of the world, and that can actually be achieved and is achievable through the provision of international aid in terms of contraceptive access, education, and emancipation of women. And food assistance and aid. Because when contraceptives are available and when women are more well educated, statistics show that societies with those things in place tend to have smaller family sizes. So he wonders then, why would anybody argue, let's withhold and withdraw aid, hope the numbers decline by people dying off? A more humane alternative to that is to try and lower the rate of new births, in which case nobody's dying, but fewer people are just born in the first place. And that's done by means of either contraceptive access, education, and emancipation of women. Because when women make input into family planning decisions, as they do when they're more well educated in those types of societies, then that also contributes to lower family size. So that's his full set of responses to those different objections. And I guess that kind of concludes our whole debate and discussion of the Peter Singer article. Now, we do have to change to the next author. Okay, so I'm going to quickly just clear the board. And let's get a taste of the other side of this argument, just get a few notes on Garrett Hardin, because he definitely takes the alternative stance on this. Okay, so this is the next author, Garrett Hardin. And Garrett Hardin's article is called Lifeboat Ethics. Lifeboat Ethics. So Garrett Hardin lived from 1915 until 2003. And this is a paper that's considered kind of a classic paper from 1974. It's called Lifeboat Ethics, the Case Against Helping the Poor. Okay, so there you see the author, the dates of his life, the title of this paper, and when it was published. So yeah, the title leaves no room for confusion about what he's going to argue, obviously. He's arguing pretty bluntly that we don't have an obligation to assist the global poor. And he would say even more so that it's not even productive or helpful when you look at it in the big picture. So it's a total contrast and a 180 difference from Peter Singer. Now, to start the paper off, he points out a metaphor that was then, in the time he wrote this, 1974, a new metaphor that was gaining popularity, and it had to do with environmentalism and conservationism. So you can imagine that, you know, in the history of planet Earth and humanity, it has not always been a huge concern, the concept of environmentalism, because prior to industrialization in the 20th century especially, there wasn't enough of a human impact on the environment yet to make it seem like it was a substantial issue that we really had to worry about. People living, you know, in previous eras of human history would have looked at the world as like limitless in its resources and bounty, and humanity not capable of doing anything, no matter how hard we tried, that could possibly undermine it or compromise its sustainability. But as we get later into the 20th century and, you know, the 70s and forward from there, it started to really be shown through evidence and through experience that we were creating problems environmentally and polluting things in the air and the water, and overpopulation and all that. So it starts to dawn on people that environmentalism is an issue that we need to focus on. So this is kind of a lot of new literature appearing then, a lot of new arguments. And one of the metaphors that were used by environmentalists of his time that Garrett Hardin did not like was a metaphor that I'll have to explain now. Spaceship Earth. So the point to refer to is that Hardin dislikes the spaceship Earth metaphor. And so I'll put that just note on the board and then try to explain why. So he dislikes that metaphor, and he gives some reasons why. Let me explain the point of the metaphor, though, first. The whole point behind it, the sort of message that it's trying to get across, is that this planet, our planet Earth, is one big home that we all share, that we all live on. And if you want to think about it, think of it as like a big spaceship floating through space, and we're all the passengers riding along on this big vessel. You know, this is supposed to give some sense that we share a home together. It's our common home, you know, planet Earth, the one planet that we all have to live on and take care of and sustain. And so if you appreciate that it's this ship that we're all riding on and it belongs to everybody, right, then that would imply that no single person, nation, or institution should use, waste, or destroy more than their fair share of the global resources, right? So basically, be conscientious about the impact that you have on the big spaceship Earth, because it belongs to all of us and we're all riding along on it as its passengers. It's supposed to give you a sense of like one common home for humanity and all the things on Earth. But he says, I don't like the metaphor, and here's why not. It indicates that we all have an equal right to an equal share of the Earth's resources. And he says, if we really took that idea seriously, it would usher in self-destructive, even he calls them suicidal policies for the sharing of resources. It would divest the wealth of the countries that have accumulated greater resources and wealth, and thereby destroy that prosperity which is needed as a beacon of opportunity for all the less prosperous nations anyway. As an example, on an individual level, if you came to wherever you live, you know, after you did some chores or duties in the daytime, errands, and when you got back home, there was like a poor homeless person in your house, and you said, you're not allowed to be here, you need to get out, this is my house, you're on my property. If the person says to you, well, I know that, but the thing is, this is a nice big house, and you have like a couple of spare bedrooms that nobody's even staying in, and I'm sleeping, you know, out on the street with no roof over my head at all. So how is it fair that you have extra space and it's not being used by anybody, and I don't have anything to sleep in or, you know, reside? Shouldn't I have access to that additional room? Isn't that just fair since it's there and it's not being used? Now, you might say, of course, no. It's my property, and even though it's not being used in a way that helps every person it could help, it's mine. Therefore, my rights entitle me to exclusivity over it. Now, in the global picture, then, the same is true according to Hardin. We cannot operate according to the spaceship Earth metaphor because it implies a sharing of resources, but there's not an equal right to an equal share. It depends on the merit of what's been accumulated, or so to speak, over time. Now, he says another reason he doesn't like the spaceship Earth metaphor, apart from the implication of shared resources, is that if it was a true spaceship, like the metaphor indicates, then it would be run by a captain, right? Because an actual ship can't just be run with nobody that's directing its course, nor can it be run by committees. So there has to be a captain, a leader. But in the planet Earth, there is no actual international or global authority like a president of planet Earth. There is the United Nations, but it's not, he points out that it's not able to actually be considered a real international authority because it's only run by means of the agreements of the member nations, and it doesn't have the power to enforce its own mandates except by means of those treaties and agreements. So it's still just a bunch of sovereign nations on this planet and not just one centralized authority, further tearing at the accuracy of the spaceship Earth metaphor. So he has his own desired alternative example or metaphor, which he thinks more accurately describes the real situation we're in. So using some facts, he tries to construct this metaphor. So two-thirds of the planet's nations are poor, the majority, and then 1/3 of the nations of planet Earth are wealthy, with the United States being the wealthiest of all. So just to point that out, 2/3 world's nations poor, and 1/3 of the world's nations are wealthy. So based on that, he says, let's consider this little hypothetical thought experiment. Suppose that each wealthy nation is symbolized by a lifeboat floating in the ocean. So, for example, here's one. This is Lifeboat USA. And there, for example, is you or whoever, one of the citizens of the United States. So for each wealthy nation in the world, there's one lifeboat, and that stands for that country. And the passengers inside of the boat stand for the citizens of that particular country. Now, this is the United States, but there are other ones. Over there is UK, Japan, Germany, France, Canada. So first world industrialized nations with a good economy. Each one is metaphorically symbolized by a lifeboat. And the United States, since it's the wealthiest nation of all, I guess this lifeboat is perhaps the nicest, with the nicest amenities and all that. Now, there's other characters, though, in this metaphor. So there's people who are out here in the water, too. And their situation is not good, because they're in the water struggling to stay afloat and survive. And they're constantly in danger of being dragged under the water waves and drowning there. Now, we're in a safe, secure boat looking out, and not much threat to our well-being, but we see there's a lot of people there that are in the water. Now, suppose that here's the way our boat works. It's currently got a number of people on it, 50 with a capacity for 60. So right now, riding along in our USA lifeboat, you have 50 passengers, and the total space that it could hold is 60. Now, suppose out here in the waters, a lot more people. There's 100 people in the water. Okay? So there's 100 of those struggling to stay afloat. There's 50 of us safe and sound in the boat. And notice how the reason he's chosen these numbers the way that he has is to mirror the ratio that's given here, right? So if it's 2/3 poor, 1/3 wealthy, this corresponds to that. 2/3 of the number 150 are in the water, and 1/3 of the number 150 are here in this nice lifeboat. Okay, so now here's the way he's setting up this question for the reader. You're in the lifeboat, and here's the question: what should we do about the 100 people in the water? Because if you're following the metaphor, who are the people in the water supposed to stand for? The global poor, right? The global poor needing help, needing assistance, not capable of making it on their own pretty much, or at least having a difficult time without more help. So what do we do about 100 people in the water? Now, he walks us through a couple of options, obviously trying to direct us towards his conclusion. But the first, question he gives is this: should we take all 100? There's 100 there. They all want help. We have a boat. Should we take 100 since all 100 need help and put them on our boat? And let me know, what do you think would be his answer and why to that initial question? Shall we take the 100? Would that be the best? And if it is, why? And if not, why not? It's not. He's really setting this up to make it easy. Yeah, there's not enough space. Good, guys. So the problem with taking 100 is that it might be the thing that you feel like doing or that you want to do because people are desperate, they're drowning even. But it's not possible because this boat, as nice as it is, it has limited capacity to provide. It has not got enough room or space for 100. So he says, to those that want to help everybody who needs help, just understand that that would go beyond the capacity that we have to provide for people. Now, one thing about Garrett Hardin, I'll just tell you, personally, I prefer Singer's argument to Hardin's, but much has been written about both, and so we're trying to have that balance and symmetry. One thing, though, whether you agree with him or not, that I personally didn't find to be the nicest part of Hardin is that stylistically, anyway, he sometimes switches into this kind of almost really cold, dark sarcasm against people who have a more sympathetic frame of mind towards the poor, like almost light mockery of such an attitude as though it's just foolish. But in this one part of the article, he says, if you're this big Christian or Marxist type or whoever who says, help everyone, then you think helping everyone is taking on all 100. In that case, your philanthropic impulses have led you to catastrophe. So he's like, if that's complete justice, then complete justice is a complete catastrophe. Ha, right? I mean, does he really have to say that? Even if his point is somewhat valid, like, I don't think there's anything wrong or deserving ridicule in case a person feels like they have that type of charitable disposition. But anyway, we go on, right? The next question he asks is this. So 100, that's a non-starter. That's no way, because it'll just sink the boat. And then if the boat sinks, it can't help anybody, even a limited number. So it's counterproductive to try and help all 100, as nice as it might be. What's another option? What about taking just 10? Now that you might think is a better choice. Why? Well, as we've described it here, the boat's not absolutely full to its max capacity. It's still got room for 10. There's 100 in the water, so you couldn't take all. But could you take just 10 and then you would still save some, but the boat would not be overwhelmed? What about 10? Now, he presents the second option of 10, but he also doesn't like that either. He says, well, there's still an issue there. If you bring on all 10, then now the boat's not going to fall over or whatever, but it's full to its maximum. And when you fill it to its capacity, then it's a little less safe. There's a safety margin that you'd like to have in case there's ever an emergency. Right now, sometimes when you're in a crowded room, nowadays we're not so much in those rooms, but back in the day before COVID, you'd walk into like a classroom, and a lot of times there's a note on the door from the fire marshal, and it says maximum occupancy, and it gives a number. And the point is that if there was an emergency or something and people had to quickly evacuate, you don't want to be in the room that's full to its absolute capacity, but that has a little spare room left over, which will make it safer in that case. So what he's saying is there's still some cost to taking even 10. It eliminates that margin of error and safety factor, and thereby makes the boat a little less safe for whoever's already there. So what he thinks is the best choice, it's the harshest choice of all, would be to not let anybody on the boat, and then instead to treat the members that would like to board, like without proper permission or something, antagonistically, like have a resolute guard against those that would get on the boat without permission. Now, he says this is a tough option, but it's the only one that's guaranteed to ensure the continued survival and prosperity of the people already safe and secure in a nice lifeboat. And he says this, some people are going to reject his answer and say that's cruel. Isn't it unfair and arbitrary that you're just born in a lifeboat or whatever, and then that's enough to say I don't want to help people that are outside of it? Isn't it just a matter of random circumstance that people are either born in the waters or on the boat? Why shouldn't they receive the same help and need? And Hardin, again, dipping into that kind of cold sarcasm or whatever it is, humor he calls it, he says, look, if you're that guilty about your position on the boat, there's one thing you could do. I bet you can guess what his suggestion is here. If you find yourself so guilty to have this nice good fortune on the boat, then maybe you could just do what? He says anybody that's on the boat and feels like their situation is not deserved or unfair, they can get off the boat and trade positions with somebody who's in the water, right, Anthony? The person that's in the water, if you don't like being the one that's so fortunate, then yield your place. And whoever takes your place is not going to feel the same sense of guilt. Otherwise, they wouldn't have replaced you in the first place. Over time, he thinks that would purge the boat of any such guilty conscience, and eventually it would just be people that are all happy to be there and then have no degree of misgivings about their good fortune. Now, I also find that to be a weird thing for him to say, because it doesn't correspond to anything that could happen in reality. So it's purely hypothetical, right? Like, there's no system in place where I can say, hey, you know what, I'm guilty about being an American, so I want to switch my citizenship status with a member of the third world. But anyway, you basically get his point. It's like the old classic love it or leave it type, argument or whatever. So with that metaphor in place, he proceeds to discuss how it applies more directly to the situation of the rich and the poor. Now, he refers to this fact that he thinks helps support his argument a little bit, and that is to mention the different rates of reproduction that exist in the first and in the third world. So let me try and give you at least a little information about that, and then we can conclude. There's only a couple more things to say about him at the top of Wednesday. So let's see here. So what's the rate of reproduction in the first world wealthy nations versus the third world nations that are living in global poverty? So population doubling, meaning going ×2. That happens in the first world, like the United States, kind of slowly, approximately every 87 years. And in the third world, in the parts of the world where there's a lot of absolute poverty, this happens much faster, approximately every 35 years. Now, there's a lot of reasons why reproduction happening more rapidly in the third world. Part of it is some stuff that I mentioned earlier when talking about Singer. In many of these parts of the world, there's not the same kind of easy access to contraceptives. In many of these parts of the world, women are less independent and well-educated in comparison to their male partners. That also inhibits their ability to make careful family planning decisions. In many of these parts of the world, there's also a desire for additional labor and support to a large communal living situation. And so sometimes you have additional children to provide for that. And then also because there's higher infant mortality in lots of these parts of the world, sometimes people will have more children just to offset the losses that could occur in early childhood from some of the children dying. So for a whole host of reasons then, there's a lot more people having children in parts of the third world where, I guess, in a way, sadly, people have the least ability to provide for a large burgeoning population. And then in the first world, it's just the opposite. People having smaller families, less children, even though there's more wealth and means to care for children. So it's exactly the opposite of what you would hope for, right? More children being produced in parts of the world where there's less ability to care for them, fewer children being produced in parts of the world where there's more ability. Now anyway, if this is the rates of reproduction and population doubling, then take the year to be right now 2020. In around 2107, which is 87 years from now, if US population is about 300 million or so right now, then it would be, if there's unchecked growth, about 600 million at the turn of the 21st century, roughly, 22nd century. But what would it be in the poor parts of the world if we had the same kind of time period that we were looking at? Well, that's what we'll start with on Wednesday, because I know we're running low on time for now. But there's a little more to just finish this up. Basically, as you can sort of see where he's leading us, in an 87-year time period, while we've doubled once, nations with equivalent population would have doubled once, twice, and halfway towards a third cycle of doubling. So if we're at 600 million in 87 years, starting from a base of 300 million, then a poor cohort in the third world of 300 million would be at 600 million after 35 years, 1.2 billion after 70, and halfway towards a doubling of 1.2 billion in 87 years. So the rates would lead to greater inequalities in terms of numbers over time. And thereby, any assistance program would inevitably have to break down under the load of the burgeoning population in the third world, which would not be expected to decrease according to his argument. It's one of the assumptions that he makes, though, that could be challenged. But anyway, that's as much as I could get in today during our Monday meeting. But thank you guys again for all your attendance and your hard work this semester so far. I'll be sending the study guide for the midterm exam over the next day or so, and then you'll have it with you and you can start thinking about your responses for the test, but that's next Friday. In the meantime, I'm still grading your first essay that you turned in last Wednesday, and they'll be done by the end of this week. So I guess we're on our way to the next couple of meetings, but thanks everyone again. I guess I'll let you go. Have a great day, and let me know if you have any questions or anything else by email. Until then, take it easy and I'll see you then. Okay? Bye-bye, guys. Thank you.